Good morning. It is Monday, April 20th, and so this is the history lesson for the day. We have been discussing World War II. When we were last together, World War II had just begun, and the Germans had employed their strategy called Blitzkrieg. And Blitzkrieg had allowed the Germans to not only roll through Poland, remember they had done that with the Soviet Union. World War II starts not only with German aggression, but also with Soviet aggression. But once they had finished off the Poles in the east, the Germans, over the winter of 39 and 40, turned their attention to the west. And so by April of 1940, the Germans launched an onslaught, and they were able to take Norway and Denmark and Belgium. And then they were able to bypass the Maginot Line. And so we had the Battle of France in May and June of 1940. Now, by June, the Battle of France was finished. The British Expeditionary Force, and that was the British Army that was located in continental Europe, the British Expeditionary Force had been forced to the beaches of Dunkirk. They had been evacuated there. That was the moment at which really Britain became on its own. Now, the British Expeditionary Force had to abandon all of its supplies. The only thing it had at this point was the men, but that was still significant. 330,000 men were now back in Great Britain, able to fight for another day. It would take some time to rearm them sufficiently, and it would also take some time to establish a beachhead in Europe from which they could continue the fight in Europe. But it did prevent Britain from being an easy target. It was a well-armed nation, and it was going to cost a lot if Germany was going to invade Britain. In the meantime, they had finished off France. The Germans had established what was called Vichy France. Vichy France was the French government that cooperated with the German government, and this cooperation included the persecution of the Jews as well. The French helped round up the Jews and send them to the concentration camps. There was a lot of there even today is still a lot of debate. Is Vichy France part of the French government history? There's been disputes about that. But so by June 1940, Vichy France is an ally of Germany. Germany has control over most of continental Europe. The only thing left for the Allies was Great Britain and the Commonwealth. Now, the Commonwealth includes Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa, and the various other former colonies who had become dominions. Like World War I, they played a major role in the outcome of World War II. They answered the call when the Commonwealth was under attack. But they were all that was left. Now, it was during this time, and I will include the video link. I very rarely link to movies. In fact, I never do. But there was a movie that has a very reasonably accurate and a very moving portrayal of Winston Churchill's speech on the House of Commons. During this time, Winston Churchill delivers a speech in which he claims that Britain will never surrender, not claims, he guarantees, Britain will never surrender, it'll fight on the land, the beaches, the sea, wherever. And he mentions until God in his providence should raise up the new world to bring in the delivery of the old, a reference to America. We're going to see one thing. Winston Churchill was a unique man. One of the greatest men of history and one of the greatest men of the last 100 years. But he was also a man of two worlds. He was British, but his mother was American. And he was one of the very few Brits who appreciated what America could be. He's also famous for his wit and his tongue. He once said of America, you can always count on America to do the right things after they've exhausted all of their options. And I say that he once said that. I believe he once said that. There have been a lot of quotes that have been attributed to Winston Churchill because of his wit. But Churchill gave the British people a sense of courage. And not just Churchill, the royal family did as well. We'll get to that. But Churchill, the royal family, Great Britain, and the Commonwealth are all that stood in June of 1940. Everything else had fallen, and it looked rather hopeless. Germany at this time issued an ultimatum. Britain refused. The ultimatum essentially called upon England to recognize the reality. It wasn't an outright surrender, not yet, but it was a formal declaration that Britain had to accept Germany controlled the continent. They refused, and so by July 1940, the Battle of Britain had begun. The Battle of Britain was a fight for control over Great Britain. Now, Hitler had a choice. We're going to get to the two options. The first, he wanted to launch an invasion. He wanted to take Great Britain. The problem was the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy was still powerful, much more powerful than the German Navy. And so because of that, he could not sail his boats filled with men across the channel. If he did, they would have been blown away by German battleships. Now, this plan was called Operation Sea Lion. It was ready to go, but before Hitler could launch Operation Sea Lion and commence the invasion of the islands of Great Britain, he first needed to control, well, the air and the sea. And so what he decided to do is before he dealt with the sea, he would deal with the air. And so once again, he turned to Hermann Goering and the German Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, and gave them the instructions, what they were supposed to do. They were supposed to destroy the Royal Air Force, subdue the skies above Great Britain, which would then allow them to pound the Royal Navy, which would then open up the paths to Operation Sea Lion. The Luftwaffe was considered the finest air force in the world. Their Bf-109 fighter was the best in a number of categories. The German pilots were well trained. They were aggressive. They had capable tactics. They had been experienced not only in the Spanish Civil War, but also in the overcoming of the Polish Air Force and the French Air Force. All that stood in the way was the RAF, the Royal Air Force. So this is the German Bf-109. They had a few other fighters as well, but by 1940, this was their frontline fighter. It was probably between this or the Supermarine Spitfire, which was the British design. One of these two were probably the finest fighters in the world at the time. Now, that was going to change. World War II was going to bring just an incredible improvement in plane design, including the advent of military jets. But that isn't to be, not yet. In June 1940, the Bf-109 was as good as it gets. It was nimble, had a fine high altitude and low altitude performances. Its turning was sufficient because what would happen is this is a fighter. Remember last time we talked about the difference between fighters and bombers. A bomber, it's an offensive weapon in the sense that it's meant to drop bombs over the enemy. But a fighter, in some ways, is a defensive weapon. It is intended to engage other fighter planes and shoot them down, and then, if need be, shoot down bombers. Fighters aren't intended to destroy targets on the ground. They're simply intended to destroy targets in the air. And when two fighters fight, it's called a dogfight. And usually when fighters fought each other, it went to the skilled pilot, the better plane. It went to who was able to maintain energy, who had altitude, who had turning radius, who had the necessary firepower. There was a lot of things that went into a dogfight, and the Germans were very good at it. So at the beginning, here we are, 1940, the Luftwaffe began by targeting the Royal Air Force bases, and that was a very sound tactic. It served two purposes. Number one, it destroyed key RAF support stations, and number two, it compelled the fighters to take off and engage. Remember, one of the primary mission here was for the German Luftwaffe to destroy the RAF. They wanted to shoot down their planes, kill their pilots, and bomb their bases. And they needed to make sure that as much as possible they could get the British planes into the air. That's where they could engage them. And by targeting the bases, the British were forced to fight back. Now, individually, the British RAF, they were the equal of the Luftwaffe. They were incredibly talented pilots. They had fine planes at their disposal. The problem is that they were much smaller. There was a lot fewer pilots and they had less planes. And so every time the British lost an airplane, it meant a lot more than every time the Germans lost an airplane. This is the Supermarine Spitfire. It is a British fighter. It was along with the Bf-109, one of the two greatest fighters in the world at the time. A sleek, excellent turning radius, great combat aircraft. It improved during the war, continued to get better and better. Just a tremendous plane. For over a month, the RAF took a pounding and responded in kind. Many RAF planes were shot down. Many Luftwaffe planes were shot down. And largely, the RAF was able to protect its bases. But remember, every time the British lost a plane, it was worth more than every time the Germans lost a plane because the Germans just had more to draw upon. By September of 1940, the men and the machines of the RAF were almost completely exhausted. The machines, they were breaking down. Fighter planes are finicky. They're meant to be flown and then repaired and then flown again. But many times these planes were being flown one mission after another, after another, after another, just round the clock. It was not only breaking the machines, it was breaking the men. At this crucial moment, just about at the moment when the Germans were going to win, Hitler made a crucial mistake. He demanded that the Luftwaffe turn its attention from the British air bases to the British cities. He wanted to start bombing British cities, and this was going to give the RAF a chance to regroup and resupply. This was a crucial moment, and it was a crucial decision. Now, this did lead to horrible suffering in London. It was known as the London Blitz, and seemingly nightly, the Luftwaffe arrived to drop bombs, often incendiary bombs, to create fires on the city of London, killing killing civilians and creating havoc and homelessness and death. But this did allow the RAF time to grow. It allowed them an opportunity to repair machines, to give men rest, to train new pilots. There were nights the RAF just didn't even challenge the Luftwaffe because they needed the break. So during this period, it looked as if the Germans were winning, but in reality, this was the opportunity that the British needed, and they used it well. Here is Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, I believe this is the Lord High Mayor of London who's accompanying him. This is Churchill right here. He is touring the ruins of London after one of the bombing raids. Churchill felt it was crucial that the people see him and know that he was with them in their suffering. Not just Churchill, the royal family as well. The royal family refused to leave London. They wanted to be with their people. It was a tremendous act of courage and of goodwill. Here is a member of the royal family. Her name is Princess Elizabeth, later on Queen Elizabeth. Princess Elizabeth was occupied during the war. She was an ambulance driver. That is her ambulance behind her. And I would point out, this was the days before automatic transmission. That is an old-fashioned manual, and she knew how to drive it well. She served her people during this time, and it was an example, but also it was courage. It gave the British people hope to see Prime Minister Churchill and the royal family engaged as they were. The Battle of Britain lasted till around May of 1941, so not quite a year, but almost a year. And it was actually the first major German defeat. During the time, especially after September, when the Germans had turned their attention to the cities, the Royal Air Force had grown in numbers and skill. And so by spring of 1941, the number of British planes that were rising to meet the Luftwaffe was becoming significant, and the losses were not nearly as important. And so every time that the German Luftwaffe arrived to drop bombs on London or Birmingham or one of the major British cities, well, they had become the prey, not the predator. The Germans were being shot down in significant numbers. And so eventually it had to be called off in the way it was being done because the Germans were losing more than the British were. Now, this had all come at a tremendous cost. 50,000 people in London had died or been severely wounded. There had been tremendous destruction. Here's a picture of the London Bridge in the background. You see the burning of London after one of the raids. But, and this is an important exception, but Britain itself was saved. The Royal Air Force held the skies over all of England. And if the Royal Air Force held the skies, and they did, then the Royal Navy could not be attacked. And if the Royal Navy could not be attacked, then they would hold the seas. And if they could hold the seas, then there could be no invasion. So long as the RAF held, then there would be no invasion. This is why Churchill later said concerning the RAF, never have so many owed so much to so few. Those RAF pilots, especially the ones from the early days of summer 1940, had held back the tide, they had defeated the Nazis, and they had saved England. By May of 1941, really any hope of Hitler had of invading had really faded. Now, I mentioned at the very beginning there were two ways Hitler could invade. Number one was by controlling the sky, but he could also just take a gamble and try to control the sea. Now, I had said the Royal Navy was much more powerful than the German Navy, and that's true. But the German Navy did have several ships that were significant. One of them was the German Bismarck. The Bismarck had sailed, really when it had left port, it wasn't designed to attack the Royal Navy. It was designed to attack merchant ships that were bringing vital supplies to England. But in the midst of this, it had actually engaged in a battle with the HMS Hood. The HMS Hood was considered one of the strongest ships in the British Navy. But the HMS Hood had a significant design flaw. And the Bismarck, in the battle between the Bismarck and the Hood and several other British ships, sunk the Hood, blew it up. It's likely that one of the Bismarck shells entered the magazine of the Hood. The magazine is where all the ammunition is stored, and it simultaneously all exploded, which destroyed the Hood. This infuriated the Royal Navy, as you can imagine. They'd lost a lot of men and a valuable ship. It depressed the nation, and so for the Royal Navy, their primary task was to find the Bismarck and to sink it. Eventually, they caught up to the Bismarck. The Bismarck took an incredible beating, but it sunk. So the pride of the German Navy, that's where it is today, at the bottom of the sea. For the rest of the war, the Germans essentially devoted themselves to U-boat warfare, or Unterseeboot, or as what we call submarines. And so the Germans put their technical expertise not into developing better ships, but in developing better submarines, and we're going to see how that affects the outcome of the war in the days ahead. So we've essentially gotten to the European theater. A theater, by the way, is a setting of war. So we've essentially gotten to the European theater all the way up to about the midpoint of 1941. We'll continue there in the days ahead.